What's up, folks? Casual Dad here, and I wanted to real quick have a conversation about one of the kind of burning issues of the current conversation around X-Wing, how it's transitioned over time, and that is, of course, as by my list title here, generic pilots. Just to rewind a bit and make sure everyone's aware of the context of that conversation. So on the left here, you've got Wedge Antilles and the T-65 X-Wing. He has the pilot ability. While you perform an attack, the defender rolls one fewer defense die. He has a name. He's got a pip next to his name that makes him unique, so you can only have one Wedge Antilles in your squad. And then he has a pilot ability. Then on the right, you have a generic pilot. That is the Cavern Angel Zealot. No pip, so you can take as many of them as you can fit in your squad, and costs 1 point less. And in this case, I believe these are XWA points, but I'd have to double check that. Has one more point of loadout. In exchange, it is Initiative 1 versus Initiative 6, so it's a lower skilled pilot, so it would move first versus moving last, and shoot last versus shooting first. A big part of the conversation around the game right now is there are a lot of people in X-Wing who have been for a long time who really love flying generic pilots over named pilots. And some of the key reasons I've heard for that are number one, that they really like making their own heroes, right? So like taking generic pilots, loading them with all of their upgrades and talents that they want to put on them, and really putting their stamp on like, this is my X-Wing, which is cool. I appreciate that. The other one is the simplicity factor. So this doesn't have a chassis ability. They're very basic. Well, it doesn't, excuse me, it doesn't have a pilot ability. They're very basic. You just put those naked on the table with no upgrades, and that's a great way to learn a simplified version of the X-Wing game, or just throw it down and play. I totally have sympathy for both of those points. I get it. But the counterpoint to that, and why it's kind of an issue, is that throughout the entire history of X-Wing, going all the way back to first edition, even very early on, there was this tipping point, right? There was always this balance point where if you make named pilots on par with generic pilots, then you see both. There's a bit of a mix. If you make named pilots dramatically better, you see just named pilots, kind of as we're tipped to now. If you ever make generic pilots even comparable or a little bit better or just enough efficient than named pilots, then they will flood the board. That's been a problem going through tournament scenes, going through casual tabletops, going all the way back to the very beginning of X-Wing. Any players who've been playing a while will remember things like the U-boats. So the tugboat or the Jumpmaster 5K, the punishing one, when it released, and for years after, they were punching holes in that chassis forever because generic Jumpmasters were an absolute menace because you could load them up with points and upgrades, and just they were so efficient that they were just utter murder on the tabletop. I believe you could take 4 at one point, but it might have been 3. I don't remember for sure. Then we also had Upsilon Spam, the First Order shuttle with the 4 primary attack and then just a ton of health. Then we had YV Spam, the YV666, the Houndstooth spam of those ships, just flooding the board with those wide attack arcs. We had, TIE Swarms, Vulture Swarms, where we had just 8 TIE Fighters or 8 Vultures. We had, and those, I kind of appreciate those being in the game. Those are a little bit different. There were moments where they're a little bit too powerful, but we are kind of well beyond that. But still, that does kind of illustrate one of the ways that it can go a little bit awry. Then we also more recently had Nantex spam, where the Nantex by itself was not great, but then if you ran as a maximum number of generic Nantex, it was actually the most efficient attack dice and hit points and chassis you could put on the board in the entire game. That won many tournaments. Just generic spam of Nantex fighters. It was probably great for people selling Nantex fighters, but was not great for the health of the game, and that was nerfed back fairly quickly. So kind of the long-term story we're talking about here, and I'm talking about this kind of broadly, and then we'll look at some specific comments on this as well. There's always that balance where you have to figure out how to keep generic pilots in the game without just having them completely run over the board. And it is very easy to lean too far one direction or the other. But I personally would say the places where we've seen the game break the most are the ones where generics lean on being too powerful or too efficient or too cheap. Yeah, just because, and the tournament scenes when these happen were particularly bad because most of the time generic spam isn't going to win a tournament. So it's never that competitive anyway. But you're talking like the top quarter of lists can beat it and go in to finish the tournament. So you didn't even see that generic spam that high on the ladder list at times, but it was such a wall that 75% of lists couldn't beat it. Either they were generic spam or they just couldn't get past that specific build to the point where it just cut out entire pieces of the meta, and you really had no idea what state the meta was in because of this 1 or 2 broken lists kind of mucking everything up. Yeah, and so leaning on named pilots, I personally think is easier to balance. As someone who really likes the named characters in the Star Wars universe, I really enjoy that too. As someone who's planning to teach my kids this game through the lens of characters they recognize and personally identify with, all of that again leans me more towards the named, unique pipped pilots. We'll talk more about some comments in a minute here, but I wanted to talk about a couple of the solutions that have been tried. So way back when, generics, they would lose slots. So you can't take a torpedo anymore, you can't take a Talon anymore. That was something that at the time Fantasy Flight Games tried to do to sort of stem this tide and stop generics from becoming problematic. More recently, how Atomic Mass Games approached it is they just made generics expensive and have low loadout, so they just were basically bad. There's nothing to keep you from still running them, but they are outcompeted in basically every single level by named pilots. Now, that doesn't hurt the simplicity argument. If you want to teach someone to play the game, you both run generics, it's fine. Um, or you play named, go easy on them or something. But it still is one way to approach the problem. To really be like, we're not going to worry about generics, let's just not deal with this. There they are. And then the 312 Squadron community points that they came out with a couple months ago, those were fun. One of the solutions they had was to pip generic pilots. So you'd have one, you could take these generic pilots, but you had to have 2 or 3. You couldn't take more than that. Where that hit a bit of a snag, I personally really enjoyed that. So if there's one generic that was way too efficient, that was held back a little bit because you didn't truly spam it. But at the same time, if your X-Wings are pipped and your A-Wings are pipped and your B-Wings are pipped, it doesn't really matter because you can still flood the board with generics, just multiple chassis. So you still have that generic span problem potentially, just multiple times. And it adds a little bit of variety, but that could be more dangerous. So I appreciate the attempt on that one. It was a good thought, and I wonder how far we could take that, because that could be a really great solution, but it needs to be a little bit more of a step. And then in the latest XWA or X-Wing Alliance points, the way they've approached it is mostly they've kept generics at kind of the same points pool as the lower middle end of the pilot pool. So for X-Wing, things go up to 6, down to 4. Cheapest X-Wings are 4. There are quite a few named X-Wings at 4, but the generics are somewhere between 4 and 5. Some are 5, some are 4. But in general, they have much higher loadout to the point where you can customize them more. So they actually compare fairly favorably with some of the lower tier named pilots. So that is another way to approach it. I have to play the game more, and kind of testing will bear out if that is a solution that's going to work. So like in this case, imagine this Initiative 1 4 cost could carry a proton torpedo. That's probably too good for a 4-point ship, but it is something to an Initiative 1. That's probably not going to break the game, but if you could flood the board with 6 of them, that's more of a problem. So I never want to see a 3-point X-Wing. Let's just start there. Let me actually get into some of the comments I've seen, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail in context of those. And these are comments on videos in my channel that are a little bit longer that I hadn't taken the time to reply to, but I've been thinking about ever since they dropped. So a couple weeks here, I've been thinking about these comments and haven't done a proper reply. So I want to go ahead and address them here, and hopefully these commenters are watching. We'll see. This is from BA1991 from 2 weeks ago. They were saying that the first points changes from the X-Wing Alliance disappointed them because, 1, they didn't analyze why players left 2.5 and stay on Legacy 2.0. Okay. 2, so changes go in the opposite way as expected, so changes didn't go the way they hoped. I would appreciate the Alliance would take notice about what is killing the game for most former players and take care of my suggestions as well to resolve those issues. Number 1, loadouts in 2.0 give more flexibility, while in 2.5 they are determined with less loadouts and less flexibility. And the outcome of the X-Wing Alliance points actually decreases loadouts for most heroes and makes the situation even worse. So you have even fewer points options that you can sink into named pilots or generics. And that's one I wanted to go ahead and talk about because we'll just talk about a couple of those pieces there too. One thing that the X-Wing Alliance did that's really interesting with points, and I touched on this earlier, but we'll go ahead and talk about it again. I think about Sunterfell and Guri, for example, are kind of 2 high initiative ace ships in the game who had their loadout slashed dramatically, to where you can still put a couple upgrades on them and you have some options. But it's actually kind of cool because you could take 1 expensive upgrade, or you can take 2 or 3 cheaper upgrades, which give you multiple upgrade options. If you had just a little bit more loadout on either of them, you would probably hit a perfect ideal build that would make them great, and that's all anyone would ever run. So by limiting some of the choices, you actually do open up a lot of options that people wouldn't try otherwise. That's an experimental assumption about where we are. We'll see if that's played out through points testing. The other approach is that one of the things that the points team did is they made some of the generics have a lot of loadout, like 20 some loadout on some of these. So you've got your cheap bottom tier Initiative 1 generic, basically the same, more or less unchanged. And then you've got one tier up, sometimes 1 point more expensive, sometimes not, with a bunch of loadout. So you actually can customize that, and it still stands on its own versus some of the named lower tier pilots. So that's an approach they took that I think was actually a good way to analyze that and kind of approach these concerns and see if they can bring over older players. Continuing here, my suggestion, example of Han Solo and Rebels. You create 3 phases of Han Solo, like Han Solo 1, 2, and 3, with more loadout for more cost. This is really interesting. I actually really like this and haven't seen anyone mention that anywhere else. So you have like an 8-point low loadout Han or a 9-point high loadout Han. So you could change how much you're spending based on what you want to build. So you could shave down your build of the Han to take a cheaper one, or you can really load that sucker up for a more expensive one. I actually really like that. That's a very cool idea, and it is a way to kind of imprint or set in stone a method to be able to pay squad points for additional loadout, which is somewhat close to what first and second edition did, having that single points pool, versus second edition where there's a pool for pilots and a pool for upgrades, and the two are separate. Versus in the past, just to talk about this, in first edition and second edition, in first you had 100 points, in second edition you had 200 points, and you would just spend your points on both upgrades and pilots. So if you've got an upgrade, that could mean one less pilot, and vice versa. If you got an extra pilot, that could mean one less upgrade. Let's see. Number 2, the missions are overrated and killing the dogfight. This issue is not solved by the X-Wing beta. And this is the points team. I have a little bit of beef with that comment because this was the points change. This was not the design team. And the design team has talked about what they're going to do. They've said many times that their current approach is to take things a little bit easy while Atomic Mass Games is finishing up their final tournament scene. And so they're really kind of putting out beta points, experimental stuff, testing things. And they have mentioned they may make changes. Like they may go from the 20-point pool to a 40-point pool or a 30-point pool. We don't know yet. We'll see where that goes. And one thing I've seen pitched is, and I think this was in one of the other documents. I forget if it was the Epic Play document or something else. I think it might have been Epic, but where you have the value of objective points. So you have fewer objectives on the table, or those objectives that used to give you 2 points now give you 1 instead. So the bulk of points earned in a game are still dogfight points. And so you still are able to push for the objective really hard, but there's fewer options to just go objectives and ignore the dogfight, which should help bring some of these players back in by making the dogfight more of a focus of the game. I get it. And I still appreciate having the objectives and the missions, because the one thing that I've never heard 2.0 players kind of counteract is having an option on the board to play to if your opponent runs. I think is really important for the health of the game. Because I saw way too many games in 2.0 where one ship would get half points on the other team, and then that squad would just scatter. And they would just try not to get hit and run out the timer. And that's... I don't love that way of playing, and that's a matter of choice, right? It was just too easy to not actually play the game once you got a lead in points. Whereas with objectives, you're constantly jockeying. You have to take the high-risk decisions to get in there and get those points back. Because if you don't contest those, your opponent's going to run off with that and they will get the lead back even if you run away. And I think that actually makes the dogfight more important. So I like the lower value points, but still having the objective points versus getting rid of missions entirely. I don't support getting rid of missions entirely at all. I don't think that would be a great choice. That's me, of course. Let's see. At the end of each, and this is talking about this, so at the end of each round, each player gets 1 point if they both have the same number of mission points, or 2 points if one player has all of them. So a little bit like Chance Engagement is right now. Which, yeah, I mean, that is more or less what we just talked about. We're having the points value, but also still having the points be a part of the game. But that would also mean that you could make a maximum of 2 points per round in objective points, which could be enough to make up the difference, especially in a 20-point system. But if we raise the points value, that very quickly loses value too. So, using no-name pilots. Here I can say the XW made some positive attempts, but I fear that it is not enough. My suggestion, and this one I thought about this for about 5 minutes. Yeah, creating a placeholder for using 3 or 2 ships of the same type, like a Z95, which would cost you, say 3 of them cost 9, 2 of them cost you 6, but you could pay 7 for 3 or 5 with 2. This could be an option to make it more attractive to use unnamed pilots in a bundle with reduced costs, which is, in a nutshell, the problem with being able to spam generic ships. The last thing we want is to make it cheaper to take more of them. I would actually go the other way and say you get a discount on a generic pilot if you take 1. Actually, I hadn't thought of that before. That's not a bad idea. So if you take only one generic pilot in your squad, you get them at 1 point reduced squad cost, but you can't take any others or they go up. That would be a way to still have generics in game, but then kind of limit them. But the problem is that any solution that balances them out in a meaningful way ends up with mixed lists where you still have named pilots in the list. And that's the problem is like if you want pure generic pilots to be an option, they're going to run over the game. And there's not a great way to balance the two without giving people what they want of being able to spam generics. I just don't think generic spam is going to be a viable place for the game. I don't think it's going to happen. And especially that because the thing is so you take 3 Z95s for 7 points. God. Yeah, 3 Z95s for 7 points, which is really low. We're talking 2 1/3 points per ship for 3 Z95s. Presumably with loadout value, so they can actually take upgrades too. Yeah, because the thing is there, then you've got 3. Why not take 6? Why not take 8? Why not take a full squad of these cheaper ships? And suddenly you're flooding the board with this stuff, and it very quickly becomes a problem. So that is missing a guardrail. There has to be something that limits it. And if you add something to that limits it, then you quickly lose the value of that. Yeah, so and it's very difficult to pull those levers. But analyzing this comment in full, this is a second edition player who really wants second edition to be the way you play the game. So I'm honestly confused about this. Like, this is one of those comments where it's like, legacy exists, and that's actually pretty much exactly what Nickel City X-Wing said at the bottom there. The legacy community is already there. We have an encapsulated snapshot of second edition with the newer ships, with some of the newer rules, as it was created by Fantasy Flight Games, the previous version. Every single thing that this guy's looking for is in X-Wing Legacy. It's there. There's no reason to redo that because it's already there. So in terms of preserving an alternate version of the game, preserving it in the current state, with some of the changes that AMG made, with some of the changes that have sort of grown into the game over time, I personally am looking forward to mixed events where we have legacy tables side by side with XWA tables. I would love to see that. That would be fun. And I think the majority of players out there are a little bit more edition agnostic than the loud players and would be happy to play either one. I would play 2.0. I would play 2.5. Yeah, that's just kind of a thing. So there's really no reason at all for the XWA to push their current edition to be more like Legacy, to be more like second edition, because then just play second edition. Yeah. But I really appreciate the both exist, because there are a core of players who really like one over the other and don't want to go from one to the other. That's fine. Let's cook. Let's all do our games. And having two distinct communities that are both officially supported is awesome. Awesome. If we can collaborate, cooperate between the two, have joint events between the two, what that does is actually ally the different factions of X-Wing and have us actually double our influence-ish, assuming both sides are roughly equal. So there's no reason for either one to consume the other, right? There's every reason for the two to cooperate and exist side by side. And that's that. So I understand the frustration here. I really like the example of the multi-phase Han Solo pilot. That's fun. I'd definitely play with that. In general, though, I understand the complaints, but most of these are like, you should probably just play Legacy, because this is, if all of these changes were to be adopted, it would be Legacy, with some minor rules revisions that people probably fight about too. So it's, I appreciate where this is coming from. This is a heartfelt comment, and it's nice to read through this, but I don't honestly agree for the points that I've made. I don't honestly agree with everything. There's a fair amount in there that's definitely worth considering. Then on the next one, this was fun. I enjoy this one. Apologies. I did have this pulled up earlier. Yeah, there it is. I'm a biased generic lover. 12 days ago, 2 days after the last comment. They seem to die almost entirely in 2.5, to die in 2.5 almost entirely due to the loss of point granularity. There just doesn't always exist a way to increase loadout value or slots to compensate for those gigantic ship point buckets. Make the ship point scale go to 50, 100, 200, even 1,000. And now Ollie and the X-Wing Alliance have the toolset to make generics appropriate. As an aside, my game groups are very casual, and so being able to walk a player through ship's abilities with generics is a godsend. Okay, cool, yeah, that's what an X-Wing or Fang Fighter does, and yep, you have 4 of them, all the same thing, let's play. Now, sure, you can just do whatever you damn well please in a casual setting. But if I were ever to have a half chance in hell of bringing one of these folks to a tourney, I would love to have some viable generic list that could reasonably exist in the meta. They do. You can run generics, and you're not guaranteed to lose a tournament. You find the most efficient generics as they exist now, practice the crap out of it, and you should actually be able to compete at a tournament setting. The problem is, though, is no matter how simple your list is, every list you're playing against is not going to follow those rules. So you're still going to have to understand named pilots, you're going to have to understand complex pilot abilities, you're going to have to understand so much about the game that someone who only plays generic no pilot ability ships ever is just not going to be able to catch up with. And it is funny, the generic conversation, I really only thought of this today, but that X-Wing is the only miniatures game that I'm aware of that even has a concept of generics, a simplified unit version. You can always run them toned down with fewer upgrades in basically any game, but even like my closest equivalent is 40k. Even in Warhammer 40k, a base Marine has a dizzying array of abilities, just all stuff going on. You get like the 5 stats, you got all kinds of interactions going on, different weapon types, different ways to build them that give them different functions. Like there's an X-wing with a pilot ability versus not a pilot ability is such a short hop um, that I don't necessarily understand the complexity argument too much. I appreciate it more than the other ones. I understand it better. Like trying to teach people how to play these games is hard enough without having extra complexity. A way you can shave that down and make it more simple. I get it. That's an important value to have. But fewer upgrades, take a couple expensive upgrades and fewer pilots, or take the pilots who have basic pilot abilities like Wedge, whose ability is just when I shoot, you get less dice. That's it. Done. Passive, no charges, no nothing weird, nothing. It's a really easy way to still play the game without relying totally on generics. And for me personally, again, one of the big draws of Star Wars is the named pilots who we recognize. When I run lists where it's like, I don't know who any of these people are, I'm always like, eh. I lose a little bit of the draw and don't like it as much as if I can be like, this is the dude that face rammed a Star Destroyer. That's great. I don't run Arvel, but you know, it's one of and when I'm teaching my kids, again, I really hope that they will learn around those named pilots, the heroes they recognize. I can already see my daughter absolutely loving to run Ahsoka A-Wing because it's Ahsoka. Um, yeah, so I don't really understand from a miniatures game, from a Star Wars game, from a game balance perspective, from a tournament perspective. I don't understand this perspective. I've heard it quite a bit, often enough to certainly highlight it, and more power to the people that really love this. For me personally, I would absolutely love to hear the stories of success stories. The players who were brought in playing only generics, the players who taught friends making only generics, the ones that brought only generics to a tournament. I would love to hear about all of those experiences. I would love to understand how this happens for people and who does it. Because somebody who's only playing the game with just generics and is very casually playing is almost certainly never going to go to a tournament. If they do, they're probably not going to have fun because they have to understand all the other garbage that's going on in the other guy's list. Other guys running Zam crew, and already you're like, all right, I'm out. I have problem running Zam or dealing with like Zam crew and pilot, and I've been playing the game for years. Um, yeah, so I still think that in terms of complexity, it does players a disservice to teach them on a simplified version of the game to that level of simplified with any expectation of them going somewhere else. I would still lean on smaller squads, just run half-size squads with named pilots, or keep the simple pilot abilities, simple upgrades. There's a lot you can do to teach the game to get people to enjoy the game without having to go all the way to generics. My personal favorite way to teach the game is through Furball. Get like 4 or 5 guys. All of you has a ship or a pilot that is pre-built, where it's just like, here's your thing, here's your 2 abilities, go to town, and then you just fight with each other in this free-for-all dogfight where you just respawn when you die. Like that, I think that's also Aces High, but I like calling it Furball. That is an amazing, super fun way to play the game, and if people understand the basic rules and interactions very quickly without the complexity of running like 5 or 6 ships. Now, they don't get the same level of like formation flying and all that, but that's more complex anyway, and something that can very quickly become unfun. I could just see somebody trying to play for the first time and trying to fly 3 TIE fighters in formation having just a nightmare of an experience, as opposed to flying 1 TIE interceptor and just having a ball. So, yeah, I get it. But also, for all the reasons I talked about before, generics break the game. That has been a huge problem since the very beginning of the game, is that if we make generics better, basically in any level, they can very quickly run over the table. And that's almost any generic chassis, although only a handful have been really that problematic. But there have been so many instances where they have been problematic that it's definitely something to be careful about. And the last thing we need is 3-point X-Wings. Do not need 3-point X-Wings. And that's like, if you take a 4-point X-Wing and that's not good enough, the next step is a 3-point X-Wing. We don't need that. Yeah, and so that's the thing. Like, you can take generic lists now, and they're not exactly unviable. Like, there's good stuff you can do with just generics, but again, it's such a short hop from a full squad to a full squad with pilot abilities that I don't really necessarily understand that, especially for tournament play, being that big of a barrier. Still, I really appreciated the time to make this comment. I really enjoyed this comment, and I'm sad that I hadn't replied, so I'm really glad I'm taking the time to address it here. I would love to hear the story from these players. And again, if you are that player, let me know. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what you're playing now and what you're doing with the X-Wing Alliance points, with the 312 Squadron points, with the AMG updated points, if you're playing in the local tournaments now or big tournaments with the end of Atomic Mass Games' tournament cycle. Whatever you're doing right now, testing out Epic, playing Armada, tell me about it. I would love to hear stories about this. I would have an absolute ball just reading through a whole list of comments, people talking about their X-Wing games and just narrating these stories and just like living that moment with you guys. I would love that. So if you do want to do that, I could collect those comments in this video and then we can go through them later. So anyway, that's it. I'll keep it there. Appreciate the time. Hopefully this is not an ice cold take, but yeah, we'll get there. Oh, there's one last thing. Okay. One comment I got today that cracked me up is, why would you name this the same as the LucasArts video game? I get it. I personally like it because X-Wing Alliance really does capture what it's trying to do as a group. It's a very nice, like, it's a cool sounding group name, very catchy. It is pretty hilarious though if you try to do the Google search, like or the Bing or whatever search. The search engine optimization is not great, just because there's such a massive storied history for the X-Wing Alliance video game that the X-Wing Alliance group has not caught up yet. But I am willing to bet within the year we can get enough web traffic to this one that this one becomes like top 3 search results, maybe top 1. We'll see if that's the challenge we can get. They've got the new website now. It's been out for like 2 months, so it's definitely got time to build that up. And we're going to see more traffic to it, more people talking about them, so that should hopefully help. Anyway, that's it. Let's get that SEO bumped up and tell me the stories about your games and what you're playing. So that's it. Cheers. Till next time.